I want you inside me. German woman's demand that made a Black American soldier lose his breath. April 23, 1945. Camp 14, Rhineland-Palatinate, Germany. The spring rain turned the prison compound into a maze of mud and despair, each footstep sucking at Private Clarence McAllister's boots as he walked his patrol route past Barrack 7. Through the wire fence, he could see them. German women, former nurses, factory workers, and party members, all waiting for processing, all wondering what would become of them now that their 1,000-year Reich had lasted exactly 12 years. Clay had been walking this same route for 6 weeks, ever since the 392nd Infantry Regiment, a segregated colored unit, had been assigned guard duty at this holding facility 50 miles west of Frankfurt. At 26 years old, the Alabama-born soldier had seen enough of war to last 3 lifetimes. He had landed at Normandy on D-Day, +7. He had fought through the hedgerows of France where men died in ditches filled with summer flowers. He had survived the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge, where frostbite killed as efficiently as German bullets. But nothing in his combat experience had prepared him for what happened at 1400 hours on that rainy April afternoon. Ingrid Müller stood at the fence, her hands gripping the wire so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She was 32 years old, though the war had aged her face beyond her years. Her blonde hair, once meticulously maintained according to the Reich's standards of Aryan beauty, now hung in limp strands around her hollow cheeks. The nurse's uniform she still wore, the only clothing she possessed, bore stains from wounds she could no longer remember treating. Clay approached the fence cautiously, his M1 Garand rifle held at port arms, as regulations demanded. The women usually kept their distance from the guards, especially from the colored soldiers. Nazi propaganda had taught them to fear Black Americans above all others, painting them as savage animals unleashed by Jewish masters to defile German womanhood. But Ingrid stepped closer to the wire. Her blue eyes, red-rimmed from crying or exhaustion or both, locked onto Clay's face with an intensity that made him stop mid-stride. "You," she said in heavily accented English, "American, Negro American." Clay said nothing. The regulations were clear. Minimal interaction with prisoners. No fraternization. No conversations beyond necessary commands. "I want you inside me," Ingrid said, her voice loud enough that several nearby women turned to stare. "Now. Today. I demand this." The words hung in the wet air between them like artillery smoke. Clay felt his breath catch in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs. Around them, the compound seemed to go silent, though he knew the normal sounds of the camp continued. Somewhere, a generator coughed and sputtered. In the distance, a truck's engine whined as it climbed the muddy road toward the main gate. Ingrid's face twisted with something Clay couldn't quite identify. Contempt? Desperation? Challenge? Her hands trembled on the wire. "You hear me? Yes?" she continued. "This is what you want, no? What all your kind wants. The propaganda, it tells us you come for our women. So here I am. Here is German woman for Negro soldier." Clay finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse. "Ma'am, you need to step back from the fence." "Step back?" Ingrid laughed, a sound without humor. "You refuse? The brave American soldier refuses?" Sergeant William Harper, Clay's platoon sergeant, appeared at his shoulder. The older man, a 40-year-old veteran from Detroit, had survived North Africa and Sicily before earning his stripes. "Problem here, McAllister?" Harper asked quietly. Clay kept his eyes on Ingrid. "No, sir. Just a confused prisoner." "Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." Now back to the story. 1931. Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Clarence McAllister had been 7 years old when he first understood what it meant to be colored in America. His father, Samuel McAllister, worked at the lumber mill 6 days a week, rising before dawn to walk 4 miles each way because colored men weren't allowed to ride the company buses. His mother, Ruth, cleaned houses for white families in the good part of town, the part where sidewalks were paved and trees lined streets that colored folks could walk down but never live on. The memory that defined Clay's childhood came on a sweltering July afternoon. He had saved his pennies for 3 months to buy a Coca-Cola from the drugstore on Main Street. 5 cents for a bottle of ice-cold happiness. He had walked into that store with his nickel clutched in his sweaty palm, approached the counter, and asked the white clerk for a Coca-Cola. The clerk had looked at him like he was something stuck to the bottom of a shoe. "Boy, your kind drinks from the colored fountain out back, and you don't come through my front door again." 7-year-old Clarence had walked out the back door, past the rusted fountain with its lukewarm water, and poured his nickel down a storm drain on the way home. He never told his parents. The shame of that moment had burned deeper than any explanation could reach. But that shame transformed into something else by the time Clay turned 18. The war in Europe was spreading like a wildfire. Germany had conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries. Britain stood alone. And in 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and America finally entered the fight, Clay saw his chance. The army was segregated. Colored soldiers served in colored units, led mostly by white officers who viewed them as laborers, not warriors. The Army's own training manual stated that Negro soldiers lacked courage under fire, that they required constant white supervision, that they were suited only for support roles. But Clay didn't care about the Army's opinions. He enlisted on December 10th, 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor. His mother had cried. His father had gripped his shoulder with hands made hard from decades of mill work and said simply, "Make us proud, son. Show them what we're made of." Boot camp at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, had been both exactly what Clay expected and somehow worse. The colored recruits trained separately, ate separately, slept in separate barracks. White officers addressed them with casual cruelty, using words Clay's father would have knocked a man down for saying. But Clay learned to shoot, to march, to follow orders. He learned that the M1 Garand rifle he carried didn't care what color skin pulled its trigger. The 392nd Infantry Regiment shipped out to Europe in August 1944. They landed in France to discover that the Army's plans for Negro troops hadn't changed. They were assigned to supply duties, loading trucks, building roads, handling ammunition. The combat units, the Glory units, remained almost exclusively white. But casualties change everything. By December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, German forces had punched through American lines with such ferocity that General Eisenhower needed every man who could hold a rifle. The color line blurred when survival was at stake. Clay had earned his combat infantryman badge during those frozen weeks. He had killed German soldiers at ranges where he could see their faces. He had dragged wounded men to safety while machine gun bullets kicked up snow around his boots. He had proven, at least to himself, that courage had no color. Now, standing in a prison camp in the spring of 1945, looking at a German woman who demanded he violate every regulation and moral standard he possessed, Clay understood that the war had taught him something else. That hatred was easy, that seeing enemies as less than human made killing them possible. 1933. Leipzig, Germany. Ingrid Miller had been 10 years old when the world changed. Her father, Otto Miller, taught mathematics at the university. Her mother, Greta, had been a piano teacher before the new government decided that women belonged in the home, producing children for the fatherland. The Millers weren't political people. They didn't attend rallies. They didn't join the party immediately, like some of their neighbors who saw opportunity in brown shirts and torchlight parades. But the changes came anyway, subtle at first, then overwhelming like a spring flood. New textbooks arrived at Ingrid's school, replacing the old ones. These new books taught racial science, explaining with charts and measurements why the Aryan race stood at the pinnacle of human achievement. They showed photographs of other races, including Africans, with captions describing them as subhuman, as threats to Germanic purity. Ingrid remembered asking her father about these lessons. Otto Müller had frowned, closed the textbook, and said quietly, "Sometimes, daughter, the government teaches things that aren't entirely accurate, but you must pass your examinations." It was the closest her father ever came to criticizing the regime. 6 months later, the university forced him to join the party or lose his position. He joined. What choice did any of them have? By 1938, when Ingrid turned 15, the propaganda had become inescapable. Radio broadcasts warned of international Jewish conspiracies and the mongrel races threatening German blood. Films shown in schools depicted Africans as cannibals and savages. The Hitler youth leaders who visited her classroom spoke of American Negroes as animals barely capable of human speech, kept as slaves by their Jewish masters until recently, now being armed and sent to defile Europe. Ingrid had believed it all, not because she was stupid or cruel, but because everyone around her believed it. Her teachers, her friends, the radio, the newspapers, the films. When everyone says the sky is green, you begin to question whether it was ever truly blue. She enrolled in nursing school in 1939, just as the war began. The Reich needed nurses. Good German girls served their country by healing its warriors. Ingrid proved talented at medicine, her father's mathematical mind finding expression in understanding anatomy, calculating drug dosages, recognizing symptoms. By 1941, she was working in a military hospital in France, treating wounded soldiers pulled back from the Eastern Front. The injuries she saw defied description. Men without faces, men without limbs, men whose minds had broken from things they wouldn't or couldn't speak about. But they were German men, and she served them with dedication that bordered on worship. The Führer's speeches on the radio spoke of sacrifice and glory. The newsreels showed German victories across Europe. Ingrid believed she was part of something historic, something righteous. The propaganda about American soldiers intensified after Pearl Harbor. The radio announcers spoke with special venom about the Negro troops. These were not soldiers, the broadcasts insisted, but criminals and subhumans that the degenerate American democracy had armed and pointed at civilized Europe. They would rape and murder. They would destroy German culture. They represented everything the Reich stood against. Ingrid absorbed these messages like drinking from a poisoned well, not knowing the water was tainted until it was too late. By 1944, when Allied bombers began turning German cities into rubble, and the Eastern Front collapsed inward like a closing fist, she still believed that German racial superiority would somehow produce victory. The hospital where she worked received wounded men from Normandy after D-Day. They spoke in whispers about American firepower, about waves of tanks and aircraft that blocked out the sun. They mentioned, always in hushed tones, the colored American troops who fought with unexpected ferocity. Ingrid dismissed these reports as defeatist talk. Propaganda had assured her that Negroes couldn't fight effectively, that they would break and run when faced with real combat. April 24th, 1945. Camp 14. The morning after Ingrid's shocking demand, Clay reported to Sergeant Harper's office in the administration building. The sergeant sat behind a desk covered with prisoner rosters, requisition forms, and the endless paperwork that characterized military occupation. He gestured for Clay to sit. You want to tell me what that was about yesterday? Harper asked, his voice neutral. Clay had spent the night lying awake in his bunk, replaying the encounter. Honestly, Sergeant, I'm not sure. She seemed like she was trying to provoke something. Harper pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and blew smoke toward the ceiling. I've been doing this job longer than you've been in the Army, McAllister. I've seen what war does to people's minds. These German women, they've been fed lies about us for years, especially about colored soldiers. I know what they think, Sergeant. Do you? Harper leaned forward. The Nazis told them you'd rape them, that you're animals, that you can't control yourselves around white women. So some of these women, when we show up and we don't act like monsters, it breaks something in their heads. They don't know how to process kindness from people they were taught were subhuman. Clay thought about this. You think she was testing me? I think she was trying to confirm what she'd been told. And when you acted like a professional soldier instead of a monster, you probably confused her more than if you'd actually been the savage she expected. Harper stubbed out his cigarette. That particular prisoner, Muller, she's been assigned to medical duties. The camp doctor needs help with the sick prisoners. You're going to be on guard duty for that detail starting today. Sergeant, is that wise, given what happened? Harper's expression hardened. You got a problem following orders, Private? No, Sergeant. Then you'll report to the medical barrack at 1300 hours. You'll maintain proper military bearing and professionalism. And if prisoner Muller tries anything else, you'll report it through proper channels. Understood? Yes, Sergeant. The medical barrack sat at the compound's northeast corner, a converted Wehrmacht barracks now serving as a makeshift infirmary. When Clay arrived at 1 o'clock that afternoon, he found Captain James Thornton, the camp's medical officer, organizing supplies on a table. Thornton was a white officer from Pennsylvania, 40 years old, with thinning hair and the perpetually exhausted look of a man who had seen too many field hospitals. You're my guard detail? Thornton asked, glancing at Clay's uniform. Yes, sir. Fine. Stay alert. I've got 23 sick prisoners in here, mostly respiratory infections and malnutrition. Prisoner Muller has nursing experience. She'll be assisting me. Thornton paused, studying Clay's face. I heard about yesterday's incident. You need a different assignment? No, sir. I can handle it. Good man. Ingrid appeared from the back room carrying a stack of folded blankets. She stopped when she saw Clay, her face going pale. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Thornton's voice broke the silence. Miller, these blankets go to beds 5 through 12. Get moving. She moved past Clay without meeting his eyes, the blankets clutched against her chest like a shield. Clay took up position near the door, his rifle held at port arms, and watched as she and Captain Thornton began their rounds. The afternoon passed in tense silence. Ingrid moved between patients, checking temperatures, distributing water, adjusting blankets. Captain Thornton examined each prisoner methodically, making notes on a clipboard. Clay stood his post, trying to appear professionally detached while acutely aware of every movement Ingrid made. Around 1500 hours, one of the prisoners, an older woman with a hacking cough, began to convulse. Thornton rushed over, calling for assistance. Ingrid responded immediately, helping to hold the woman steady while the doctor administered medication. Clay watched them work together with practiced efficiency, reminded that war made strange necessities of former enemies. When the crisis passed, and the woman lay breathing easier, Thornton stepped outside for a cigarette break, leaving Clay and Ingrid alone in the infirmary for the first time since the fence incident. The silence stretched like razor wire. Finally, Ingrid spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Yesterday, at the fence, I did not mean... She stopped, struggling for words in English. It was not what you think. Clay kept his eyes forward, his voice flat. I don't need to know what you meant, ma'am. It's not my concern. You do not understand. Her accent grew thicker with emotion. For 3 years, they tell us about American Negro soldiers. The radio, the newspapers, the party leaders. They say you are monsters who will hurt us. They say you are not truly human, that you cannot control your urges. Clay's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. When I see you at the fence, I think maybe if I say this terrible thing, maybe you will act like the monster they promise. Then I will know the propaganda is true. Then everything I believe, everything I have lost, it will make sense. She was crying now, tears running down her hollow cheeks. But you did not act like a monster. You act like a gentleman, and now I do not know what to think about anything. Clay finally turned to look at her. This woman who represented everything he had been taught to hate. This German who had served the Reich, who had believed the poisonous lies about his people. He saw something in her face that he recognized. Not from looking at Germans, but from looking in mirrors in Alabama when he was young. The expression of someone whose entire understanding of the world had just shattered. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I reckon propaganda is a powerful thing. Back home in Alabama, white folks got their own propaganda about colored people. They say we're lazy. They say we're stupid. They say we're dangerous. Most of them believe it same as you believed what you were told about me." Ingrid wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "And you hate them for this?" Clay thought about that 7-year-old boy in the drugstore. He thought about his father walking 8 miles every day because colored men couldn't ride the bus. He thought about proving himself worthy in a war fought for a country that treated him as less than human. "I don't know what I feel about hate anymore," he admitted. "I've hated enough people to last a lifetime. Germans, white officers who treated me like dirt, enemy soldiers trying to kill me. But here's what I learned. Hate don't make you strong. It just makes you tired." Captain Thornton returned, ending their conversation. But something had shifted in the space between them. Not forgiveness. It was too soon for that. Not trust. The war had burned that commodity away. But perhaps the first crack in the walls that propaganda had built in both their minds. As Clay walked his evening patrol that night, he thought about Sergeant Harper's words, about minds broken by lies, about people trying to understand a world that no longer matched what they had been taught. He thought about Ingrid's face when she realized he wouldn't hurt her, wouldn't prove the propaganda right. He wondered if change could begin in moments as small as refusing to become the monster others expected. If healing could start in a prison camp, where a German nurse and a colored soldier from Alabama discovered they were both more human than the propaganda on either side had ever allowed them to be. April 27th, 1945. Camp 14, Medical Barrack. 3 days had passed since Ingrid's confession in the infirmary. The routine had settled into an uncomfortable rhythm. Each afternoon, Clay stood guard while Captain Thornton and Ingrid tended to the sick prisoners. They worked in near silence, speaking only when medical necessity demanded it. But small things were changing in ways Clay couldn't quite name. On this particular afternoon, Ingrid was distributing the midday meal to patients too weak to walk to the mess hall. The rations were meager. Thin soup made from vegetable scraps, a slice of dark bread that might have weighed 3 ounces. The Allied supply lines prioritized combat troops and liberated concentration camp survivors. Prison camp rations came last. Clay watched Ingrid move between beds, ladling soup with hands that trembled from her own hunger. She was thinner than when he'd first seen her at the fence. Her uniform hung loose on her frame. The hollows under her cheekbones had deepened. At 1400 hours, Captain Thornton left to attend a staff meeting at headquarters. Clay found himself alone with Ingrid and 20 sleeping or unconscious patients. The spring sunlight slanted through the barrack windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like lazy snow. Ingrid sat heavily on a stool near the supply table. She hadn't eaten yet. Clay had watched her give her own portion to an elderly woman who couldn't stop coughing. He thought about Sergeant Harper's words, about minds broken by war, about people trying to survive in a world turned to ash. He thought about his mother in Alabama, who had cleaned white people's houses and saved every scrap from their tables to feed her own children. Clay reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his own lunch ration. He'd saved it from the morning meal. 2 thick slices of white bread with butter, a chunk of cheese, an apple that had come all the way from America. He walked to the supply table and set the food down in front of Ingrid. She looked up at him with confusion and something that might have been fear. "I cannot take this." "You already gave your meal away," Clay said quietly. "I saw you. This is against regulations, yes? Fraternization with prisoners?" "Probably." Clay stepped back to his post. "But I reckon letting you starve to death is against regulations, too. Doctor needs his nurse healthy." Ingrid stared at the food for a long moment. Her hands trembled worse now. Clay could see the internal war on her face. Pride fighting hunger. Propaganda fighting common sense. Everything she'd been taught about accepting anything from a Negro soldier warring against the simple animal need to eat. Finally, hunger won. She picked up the bread with both hands and bit into it. Tears ran down her face as she chewed. Not from sadness, Clay realized, but from the overwhelming sensation of eating real food after weeks of near starvation. She ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was a feast instead of a simple sandwich. When she finished, she wiped her eyes and looked at Clay with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why do you do this?" she asked. "After what I say to you at the fence? After all the terrible things?" Clay thought about how to answer. About all the times white people in Alabama had shown him small kindnesses despite the system that said he wasn't worthy. The white grocer who sometimes added an extra potato to his mother's bag. The white doctor who treated colored patients after hours when no one was watching. Small acts of human decency that existed in the cracks of a cruel system. "Because you're hungry," he said simply, "and I had food. Don't need a more complicated reason than that." Ingrid nodded slowly. She didn't say, "Thank you." The words probably wouldn't come yet. But something had shifted again. Another small crack in the wall between them. May 2nd, 1945. News came through official channels that morning. Adolf Hitler was dead. Suicide in his Berlin bunker, while Soviet shells fell on the Reich Chancellery. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted exactly 12 years and 4 months. Clay heard the announcement during morning formation. Lieutenant Morrison, the camp's executive officer, read the telegram in a flat voice that suggested he couldn't quite believe it himself. Some soldiers cheered. Others stood silent, trying to process what this meant. The war in Europe was effectively over. Germany would surrender within days. But victory felt hollow when you stood in a prison camp surrounded by the rubble of a civilization that had tried to conquer the world and failed catastrophically. That afternoon in the medical barrack, Ingrid heard the news from another prisoner. Her reaction surprised Clay. She didn't cry, didn't rage. She simply sat down on her stool and stared at her hands for 5 full minutes without moving. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. 12 million dead. For nothing. All of it, for nothing. Captain Thornton was examining a patient with pneumonia. He didn't look up. Wars like that. Makes you wonder what any of it was for. Ingrid stood and resumed her work, but Clay could see the difference in her movements. Something fundamental had broken. Not just her country's defeat, but the final death of whatever belief had sustained her through the war years. Over the next week, Clay continued bringing her food. Never his entire ration, just portions he could spare. An orange one day, a chocolate bar the next. She accepted these offerings with increasing ease, though she still couldn't quite meet his eyes when she took them. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. Victory in Europe Day. The war was over. Clay spent VE Day walking his patrol route, watching German prisoners through the fence as they absorbed the news. Some wept openly. Others showed no reaction at all. A few seemed almost relieved that it was finally finished. The next afternoon, Clay noticed Ingrid struggling with something at the supply table. Her glasses had broken, one of the wire arms hanging loose where the solder had given way. She was trying to work without them, squinting at medication labels, holding bottles close to her face. Captain Thornton had gone to headquarters again. Clay watched Ingrid struggle for 20 minutes before making a decision that probably violated half a dozen regulations. "Let me see those," he said, approaching the table. Ingrid handed over the broken glasses without argument. Their fingers touched briefly during the exchange. Her hands were cold despite the warm afternoon. Clay examined the break. The wire arm had snapped at its thinnest point. He pulled out his utility knife and cut a thin strip from the cloth tape in the medical supply box. Then, with careful precision, he wrapped the tape around the break, reinforcing it with multiple layers. "Won't be perfect," he said, handing them back, "but should hold until you can get proper repairs." Ingrid put on the glasses and blinked. She could see clearly again. She looked at Clay for a long moment, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since their encounter at the fence. "Thank you," she said. Two simple words that carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. May 15th, 1945. The warm spring had given way to early summer heat. Camp 14's population was shrinking as prisoners were processed for release or transfer. The administrative machinery of occupation ground slowly forward, sorting through the wreckage of the Nazi regime. Ingrid and Clay had developed an unspoken routine. Each afternoon in the medical barrack, they worked in parallel. He stood guard. She tended patients. They exchanged few words, but the silence between them had transformed from hostile to something approaching companionable. On this particular afternoon, with Captain Thornton examining a new arrival from a labor camp, Ingrid spoke suddenly into the quiet. "My brother died in Russia," she said, still focused on the bandage she was changing. "Stalingrad, January 1943. He was 19 years old." Clay didn't respond immediately. He'd learned that sometimes people just needed to speak, not to be answered. "They sent a telegram," Ingrid continued. "Fallen for Führer and fatherland. This is what they write. Like it means something. Like those words make it better that my baby brother froze to death in a ruined city thousands of kilometers from home." She finished the bandage and moved to the next patient before continuing. "The radio tells us it is glorious sacrifice, that he died for Germany's future. But there is no future now, is there? Just this." She gestured at the barrack, the camp, the destroyed country beyond the wire. "I had a cousin died at Normandy," Clay said quietly. "James. He was in the 92nd Infantry Division, stepped on a mine outside Carrington. They sent his mother a telegram too, said he died bravely, but brave don't bring him back." Ingrid looked at him directly now. "You fight at Normandy?" "Landed 7 days after. Saw enough to last a lifetime." "And you hate Germans now? For killing your cousin?" Clay thought about this carefully. "I hated the Germans shooting at me. Still do, I reckon. But you weren't shooting at me. Your brother wasn't shooting at my cousin. War puts people in places they never would have chosen, and makes them do things they never would have done otherwise." "This is very American thinking," Ingrid said, but there was no malice in it. Very democratic. In Germany, we learned that nations have souls, that the German soul is different from the American soul, that some peoples are born to rule and others to serve. How's that working out? Clay asked, then immediately regretted the harshness. But Ingrid smiled grimly. Not so well, I think. Captain Thornton finished his examination and called Ingrid over to assist with medication. The moment ended, but something had been established. They could talk now. Not as guard and prisoner, not as victor and vanquished, but as two people who had survived the same terrible years. May 22nd, 1945. The breakdown came without warning. Clay had noticed Ingrid growing quieter over the past few days, more withdrawn. She performed her duties mechanically, speaking only when necessary, eating the food he brought her with none of the previous gratitude. That afternoon, while Captain Thornton was in his office doing paperwork, Ingrid was cleaning the supply cabinet. Clay heard her breathing change, short, rapid gasps like someone drowning on dry land. He turned to find her standing motionless, a bottle of morphine clutched in her shaking hands. Tears streamed down her face. "I give this to dying soldiers," she whispered. "I hold their hands when they cry for their mothers. I tell them they are brave, that they serve the fatherland, and all of it is lies." The bottle slipped from her fingers. Clay caught it before it hit the floor. "I am guilty," Ingrid said, her voice breaking, "of all of it. The war, the lies, the death. I believe the propaganda. I wear the uniform. I serve the regime that killed millions. And for what? For nothing. For worse than nothing." She collapsed onto the stool, her whole body shaking with sobs. Clay stood frozen, every regulation screaming at him not to touch a prisoner, not to show weakness, to maintain professional distance. But regulations seemed less important than the human being falling apart in front of him. He set his rifle carefully against the wall and pulled over another stool. He sat down facing Ingrid, close enough that she could feel his presence but not touching her. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "You can't carry all that guilt by yourself. You were a nurse. You healed people, that's what you did." "But I believed," she sobbed. "I believed the lies about you, about Jews, about everyone they told us was less than human. How do I live with that?" Clay thought about Tuscaloosa, about the drugstore that wouldn't serve him, about every white person who had crossed the street rather than share a sidewalk with a colored man, about the propaganda in America that said his people were inferior, criminal, dangerous. "I know what it's like to be judged by my skin," he said. "I know what it's like to be more than what others see. And I reckon if I can forgive the white folks back home who believed lies about me, you can learn to forgive yourself for believing lies about others." Ingrid looked up at him through her tears. "Why are you still so kind to me after all I have said and done?" "Because kindness is a choice," Clay said. "And I choose to see you as a person, not as what your country did. Same as I hope people see me as more than just my skin color." May 28th, 1945. 2100 hours. Clay was off duty, sitting outside his barracks writing a letter home to his mother. The evening air was warm and still. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played American swing music. The explosion came without warning. The ground heaved beneath Clay's feet. A massive boom rolled across the camp like thunder from a vengeful god. The windows of his barracks blew inward, showering glass across empty bunks. Clay hit the dirt instinctively, his combat reflexes taking over. More explosions followed. 3, 4, 5 in rapid succession. The medical barrack erupted in a fireball that lit up the evening sky. Screams rose from the prisoner compound. Clay ran toward the flames without thinking. Other soldiers emerged from buildings, shouting orders, running with fire extinguishers and medical kits. Sergeant Harper appeared, organizing response teams. McAllister, help evacuate the medical barrack. Clay reached the building as the roof began to collapse. Inside, Captain Thornton was pulling unconscious patients toward the door. Smoke filled the interior, thick and choking. And there was Ingrid, trying to lift an elderly woman who couldn't walk. "Get out!" Clay shouted at her. "Not without my patients!" They worked together, dragging 7 people clear before the ceiling gave way completely. Clay felt something hit his left shoulder, a burning impact that drove him to his knees. Blood soaked his uniform. Ingrid saw him fall. She dropped to his side, her nurse training overriding everything else. "You are hurt," she said, already examining the wound. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his shoulder. Not fatal, but bleeding heavily. She ripped strips from her uniform skirt, pressing them against the wound with firm pressure. Around them, the camp burned. Sirens wailed, people screamed. But Ingrid worked with steady hands, treating the enemy soldier who had shown her kindness. "Why?" Clay asked through gritted teeth. Ingrid met his eyes. "Because you taught me something. That people are more than the uniforms they wear or the color of their skin. That kindness matters. That maybe, if enough people choose mercy over hatred, the world can heal." She tied off the makeshift bandage. Medics were arriving now, taking over treatment. But for that moment in the burning night, a German nurse and an American soldier had chosen to save each other. The camp had been hit by remnant Nazi fighters, a final desperate attack that accomplished nothing except more death. But from that destruction, something improbable had grown. Not forgiveness yet, not redemption, but the beginning of understanding that humanity could survive even the worst that war had to offer. June 15th, 1945. Camp 14, Processing Center. The war had been over for 5 weeks. Europe was beginning the long work of counting its dead and rebuilding what remained. Camp 14 would close by month's end. Prisoners were being released, sent home to whatever homes still existed. Ingrid Miller stood in the processing line with 40 other German women. Each held a single bag containing everything they owned. Behind them lay months of captivity. Ahead lay an uncertain future in a country that no longer existed in any meaningful way. Clay's shoulder had healed, leaving a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. He was back on duty, but the 392nd Infantry Regiment would ship home to America within weeks. The segregated unit had served its purpose. Now the colored soldiers would return to a country that had needed them for war, but still didn't want them as equals. He wasn't supposed to be at the processing center. His duty station was 2 buildings away. But he'd known today was Ingrid's release date. She saw him standing by the gate and stepped out of line. No one stopped her. The regulations that had governed every minute of camp life were loosening as the administrative machinery wound down. They faced each other in the morning sunlight. 2 people who had traveled from mutual contempt to something that resembled understanding. Not friendship, exactly. The wounds were too fresh for that. But recognition of shared humanity. "So you go home now," Ingrid said. "Back to Alabama?" "Eventually. Army's got to process us out first." "And what will you do there, after all you have seen?" Clay thought about Tuscaloosa, about the drugstore that wouldn't serve him, about his father walking 8 miles to work every day, about all the small cruelties of a system built on the idea that some people mattered less than others. "I reckon I'll try to change some things," he said. "War taught me that people can learn to see past what they've been told. If you can learn I'm human, and I can learn you're human, maybe folks back home can learn the same." Ingrid nodded slowly. She pulled an envelope from her bag. "I write this last night, for you, but I do not know if I should give it." "What is it?" "A request. The American authorities, they offer some of us asylum. We can immigrate to America instead of staying in Germany. I apply for this. But I do not know if it is right. To come to your country after everything. Clay felt something shift in his chest. He reached into his own jacket and pulled out a folded letter he'd written 3 days earlier. I wrote you something too, he said. Been carrying it around, trying to decide if I should give it to you. They exchanged letters in silence. Ingrid opened hers first. Clay watched her face as she read his careful handwriting. The letter was simple. An address in Tuscaloosa. An invitation to write to him when she arrived in America. An offer to help her find work with the church groups that were sponsoring refugees. And at the bottom, a single line that had taken him an hour to write. You're more than your country's ideology. We all are. Ingrid's hands trembled as she folded the letter and held it against her heart. You really believe this? That I can start? Again? I believe people can change, Clay said. I've seen it happen. Lived it myself. She opened her own letter and showed him. It was written in English, the words carefully chosen. She had requested asylum in America. She wanted to work with organizations helping war refugees. She wanted to spend her life healing the damage she felt she had caused. And she had written Clay's name as her character reference. I tell them that an American soldier showed me what kindness means, she said quietly. That he taught me people are more than the uniforms they wear or the color of their skin. Is this acceptable? Clay felt his throat tighten. Yeah, that's acceptable. The processing officer called Ingrid's name. Her group was moving out. She gripped Clay's hand briefly, the first time they had deliberately touched. Thank you, she said, for seeing me as human when I did not deserve it. Everybody deserves it, Clay replied. That's what I learned. September 3rd, 1945. Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Clay stood on his parents' porch, reading a letter that had traveled across the Atlantic. Ingrid had arrived in New York 2 weeks earlier. She was working with a Lutheran relief organization, helping process refugees. The work was hard, but meaningful. She was learning that redemption was possible through service. She ended the letter with a promise, that she would spend her life teaching others what a colored soldier from Alabama had taught her. That kindness could bridge any divide, that humanity could survive even the worst that war had to offer. Clay folded the letter carefully and looked out at the street where he'd grown up, where he'd learned what it meant to be judged by his skin, where he'd decided to prove his worth by going to war. The war was over, but the work of building a better world was just beginning. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people chose mercy over hatred, the world really could heal. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.